Um, all right, so recording is started. So my name is Denyse Schrenker, and I am the Horticulture and Small Acreage Extension Agent for Eagle County. And today I'm going to be talking about starting seeds indoors. And I'm going to start sharing my screen here. All right. Are you seeing my presentation now?
Yes, we got it.
Perfect. All right. So first I'm going to start off with just kind of the basic supplies that you need for starting your seeds indoors. Of course, you need a light source, and we'll be going into all of these a little bit more. So this is just an overview. Need a light source, a soilless seed starting mix, some sort of container, and then optional are heating mats and fans. Okay, and so for light, you can use a south-facing window, although it can be pretty hard to get good seedlings from natural light alone. The south-facing window will be your best bet, but it would be good to use a heat mat or something to protect from the cold if they're sitting right in a windowsill. The windowsills typically are too cold for very happy seedlings. It can lead to poor germination and poor root development of the seedling. So if you are using a windowsill and it's pretty cold, then you're going to want to use a heat mat with that. And we'll talk about heat mats a little more in a bit. And then the other thing, I showed this picture. So this is our office, and it is this direction is facing south. So it's a really big window and it does get quite a bit of light, but you can kind of tell from some of these succulents, they're still veering off towards the light. So even in this bright window, your seedlings would still start going a little, growing towards the light, and they could get a little bit tall and leggy. So even with this bright window, it's still a really good idea to provide some supplemental lighting. And this lighting, you don't have to have fancy grow lights. 40-watt fluorescent tubes are completely adequate. Hello, welcome for joining. But yeah, so the 40-watt fluorescent tubes are adequate for light, and they're typically a lot less expensive than the specific grow lights. So those are, and you can just use a shop light fixture for it as well. But those fluorescent tubes are going to be kind of your least expensive option for grow lights. And you want to use either two cool white tubes or 1-to-1 with one of the cool whites and natural daylight tubes. But that's kind of going to be your least expensive option for supplemental lighting. And if you're only starting maybe a few plants, they even have they're like a little lamp, but they have grow lights in them, or you can put a grow light in a little lamp if you just have a really small setup and only want to start a few seeds. That's completely fine too. But yeah, even in the windows, it's good to have some extra supplemental lighting. Sometimes this time of year we have cloudy days, and yeah, it's just really hard to get enough light from windows. So. The other thing for your lights, you want to put them on a timer. So plants do need a dark period to develop properly. So you don't want to leave them on all the time. So you want to put those on a timer, and you can set it for somewhere between 12 and 16 hours is good. And this is just a picture of one of the timers I have at our office. This is what they look like. And then to set them, you just punch, either pull up or punch down the these little tabs that go around there. So they're really easy to use and they're pretty cheap too. So you want to get a timer for your lights. And then the other thing with lighting is you're going to suspend those lights about 2 to 4 inches above the plant. If you are using a specific grow light, then you might want to go at least 4 inches up because they're just a little bit stronger. And if you're seeing the tips of your plants burn a little bit, then it might be too close, but 2 to 4 inches is usually good. With the fluorescents, you can go a little bit lower, but with those, if you are using lights that are specific grow lights, then going a little bit higher, like 4 inches, is going to be better. The other thing to consider is you can consider attaching aluminum foil or a mylar blanket to the lights, and that will help reflect your light back onto the plants. And it also helps maintain a more constant temperature and humidity. So I'm going to go back a slide to this one. So this is my seed starting setup. I have it in it's actually just in our crawl space at our office. And so here's my lights, and then I've attached mylar blankets to the side of those to help, since it is in a crawl space. And I start my onions in February, so it's pretty cold down there. And so that mylar blanket helps keep it warmer for the plants. And then this is the heating mat underneath here. So but yeah, light is the most important part of this. So having a good light source is really important to getting good, healthy seedlings. Otherwise, they just get tall and leggy, and they're never going to fully really recover from that. So lighting is one thing you want to make sure that you really have adequate lighting. Oh, next thing that you need is a seed starting mix. And so these seed starting mixes are actually soilless. They don't contain any soil. They're typically a mix of peat moss and vermiculite. And sometimes they might be called a germination mix. So if you're looking to buy it, look for the words either soilless, seed starting, germinating, or germination mix. All of those will work well for starting your seeds. And the important part about this is that your seed starting mix is sterile, lightweight, and kind of a fine texture. So you don't want to use garden soil because, well, for one, it's not sterile. And so you can sometimes introduce some diseases to your plants, but also it's typically a really heavy texture. And so just too heavy for your seedlings to get started really well. And then also potting mixes, you want to avoid potting mixes because they tend to have big chunks of bark in them. And so that's what I mean by the fine texture, is you don't want large chunks of bark or little sticks and things like that in it. Since you are planting tiny little seeds and they need to be in good contact with the soil, sometimes the bark and things can get in the way of that. And then also as the roots develop, it can sometimes cause issues for those tiny little seedling roots. So it's best to go with a specific seed starting mix. And that's the other thing you can look on if you're not quite sure, and you look on the ingredients. You're going to see things just like sometimes cocoa coir, sphagnum peat moss, perlite, and then usually there's some fertilizer that's added. And in the handout that I put in the chat, there are some recipes, some examples of soilless mixes if you would like to make your own. If you're going to be starting a lot of seeds, then it's usually more cost effective to mix your own. But if you're only going to be starting a few, then it's easier to just buy a seed starting mix. But the main thing, yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about peat, using peat, and maybe an option for a peatless potting or starter?
Yeah, so the peat moss is in pretty much all of the starters, but you could substitute it. It would probably work to substitute it with the cocoa coir. You're just going to need to water a lot more often because that's not going to hold as much water. So you could use cocoa coir, and then you're also probably going to want to use some compost with that as well. But you're going to, for the compost, make sure that it's disease and weed free. So from a good source, and also ideally a plant-based compost versus a manure-based compost. But yeah, you could mix the cocoa coir and compost as an alternative to peat moss.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yep. And so there's just an example. This is just an example of the peat moss, and then the vermiculite. And you'll look for horticultural grade for that perlite or vermiculite. And so that's because you just don't want it to be a super fine dust. You want it to be not a massive pellet, but a decent sized pellet. So the horticultural grade will be like that. And then here's just example of a soilless mix and the ingredients that they've got in it. All right. Oh, the next thing you need are containers. Main thing with containers, they need to have a drainage hole. So you can use kind of any container you want, but it does need to have a drainage hole. I do find that it's best to have one seedling per container, because if you have a whole bunch in one container, it can be really hard to separate them. Or you can start them in one container, and then when they're still really little, like just a week after germinating, you can separate them into their own containers. But if you wait too long, then the roots just start growing together, and it becomes really hard to separate them without damaging the roots. So I think it's easier to just do one per container, and then not have to worry about damaging your roots. And if you're reusing containers, then you're going to want to make sure you sterilize those first. So you can wash those with soapy water and then rinse them, and then dip them in a solution of 1 part bleach, 9 parts water. Dip it in there and then let it dry. And then you can go ahead and plant into those. They also make these peat pots. I really like to use these peat pots for squashes and some things that are like a little bit more finicky about being transplanted, because you're not, you don't have to pull them out of the pot. You're just sticking the pot right in the ground. And so that kind of helps with those sort of more finicky about transplanting vegetables. But you do, the other thing with peat pots is if the plant's going to be in the pot for much more than a month before it gets planted outside, they kind of start to fall apart. And so it helps with, so those squashes and like cucumber, that kind of stuff, you're only starting it for a few weeks, works really well for those. I have started other like tomatoes and things in them, and I've had to put them in, move them from their peat, well, just put the peat pot in a plastic pot because the peat pot unfortunately disintegrated before they were ready to go in the ground. So yeah, I tend to stick to squashes with those pots. All right, and then optional things, a heat mat and a fan. The heat mat is really great for promoting root growth, and it also helps you get a lot better germination rates with the heat mat. The soil temperatures are typically about 5 degrees cooler than your air temperature. So the heat mat just helps get that soil temperature up. And a lot of this soil, a lot of vegetables, their optimal germination temperature is fairly high, like tomato, for example, is 70 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit. And it's hard to get that soil temperature indoors. So the heat mat will help, especially with those heat-loving veggies, those warm season veggies. So I definitely recommend using one. I think it's really helpful. And this picture here, that's the probe, the temperature probe. So you just put the temperature probe in the soil, and then you have a little controller here that you can set the temperature. And so you could even set it at different temperatures based on the optimal temperature for the veggie you're growing. And in the handout, I have a link to a chart that has the optimal soil temperatures for different vegetables and their germination. So if you want to get really technical with it, you can, but usually just around 70 to 75 is going to be a good temperature for most of your vegetables. And it's also especially helpful, like I couldn't really start my seeds very well without a heat mat, since I do start them in our crawl space where it's so cold. So if you're in a windowsill or a basement or someplace or a garage, someplace that's kind of cold, this is going to be very helpful for you. So the other optional thing is a fan, and this is just like a little fan, nothing special about it. But having a fan blowing on your starts can help prevent fungal problems. It just keeps that air circulating a bit. It improves your seedling strength also, since it gets that waving motion going, and it helps them grow stronger stems. And then it also kind of helps start your hardening off process. So that process of moving your veggies from their nice little indoor environment to the harsh outdoor environment. Gets pretty windy here. So that kind of helps them get adjusted a little bit to that. And this you don't have to have it blowing on them all the time. You can have it on a timer, or if you just want to turn it on during the day and then turn it off, that works. But just getting a little airflow blowing across your seedlings. And if you don't have a fan, or if you don't want to use one, you can also just brush your hand across the tops of the seedlings, and do that daily too. So that works as well. But these two things, they are optional. But with the heat mat, if you're starting them in a cold place, then that's going to be very helpful for you. Oh, and then another thing to note about the fan and the heat mat, actually, they will increase your water usage. So you will have to water your seedlings a little bit more often. Okay. Now going On to seeding, so talk about the veggies that do better when they're started indoors. Timing, so when to actually start these seeds, planting depth, and then how many seeds to be starting. So veggies to start indoors, and this is kind of my priority. So your priority might be different, but this is my priority for starting seeds indoors. First one, tomatoes, your warm seasoned veggies like tomatoes, pepper, eggplant, and basil. These things take a pretty long time to mature, and so it's a pretty long time to harvest. And so it's really hard in our environment to plant them as seeds outdoors, and then get that plant to maturity before it frosts. So these are ones that you want to either buy as a transplant, a little plant start, or start them indoors. The second one, and these are because these are cool season veggies, but they are ones that they can kind of take a while too. You can start them outdoors successfully if you'd like, but starting them indoors just kind of gives them a bit of a jump. And then you can also plant them outside earlier and get earlier harvests. So if you want to try and squeeze in to like a second round of crops, then it's really good to start these guys indoors. So those would be broccoli, Brussels sprouts especially because they are slow. So it helps to start the Brussels sprouts indoors. But broccoli, cauliflower, and cabbage also can be helpful to get them going a little early. And then onions and leeks. So onions, if you're starting it from seed, you definitely have to start these indoors because they also take a really long time to mature. They do great in Colorado, but they're just slow. And same with leeks. If you're starting onions, you can sometimes buy them as, sometimes you can buy them as little plants, but also sometimes you can buy them as what's called a set, as just like a little bulblet. And the sets you can start outdoors. Those are fine. You don't need to start those indoors, just the seed. So then 3, and the reason that these ones are kind of lower on my list for starting indoors is because they're very sensitive. They're pretty sensitive to being transplanted. They don't like their roots being disturbed very much. And so they usually do just fine if you're starting them outdoors. So from my space priority, they get bumped down a little bit. So squashes, especially the summer squash, so your yellow squashes and zucchinis, those I usually start outdoors, but some of the winter squashes, butternuts and things that take a long time, those can be helpful to start inside. And same with melons and cucumber would fall into there. And that's why I use those peat pots in here. The other thing with all of these, the squash, pumpkins, melons, cucumbers, you don't want them to be very old transplants. 3 weeks is good for those. So you want to plant those outdoors at about 3 weeks old. You don't want them to get more than a month old. They just don't transplant as well. And then 4th would be celery and artichoke. I have those there. They do need to be started indoors, but they're also really challenging to grow in Colorado. So they're kind of like my, if I have room, and my experimental things that I'm growing just for fun are at the end of the list. And then if I happen to have room, I might start some spinach or lettuces or collards or kale indoors. Of course, you can direct seed those in the garden and they grow great. But if you want to try and kind of get a super, super early spinach crop or something like that, then, and you have some extra room, then they transplant really well. So those would be ones that you could start indoors as well. And like I said, that's just my priority. You can start whatever you want. But yeah, and now the big question of when to start seeds inside. And so your seed start date, this is just kind of the equation of how it's figured out. It's your seedling plant out date. So when you want to take your seedling or your little transplant and actually plant it outside in your garden. So it'd be that minus the desired seedling age. So how old you want it to be when you're planting it out, minus the average time it takes for that to sprout. Now, you don't have to go through and calculate this for all the veggies. People have already done that for you. And so the one thing you do need to know, though, is your average frost-free date. And so this is your typical date of the last frost. And I am actually going to switch out of this for a second so I can show you a couple of things here. So here's one way you can figure out your average frost-free date is that link that was in the presentation, but it's also in that handout. So you can get to this from the handout. It's just the Farmer's Almanac frost date calculator. So you put in your location. I have Basalt in here, but the nearest station was Aspen Pitkin. So Carbondale or Glenwood might actually be more accurate, unless you're at a higher location. And this one's pulling it up from Glenwood Springs as the nearest station. So they have their last frost date as May 22nd. The other thing that I have in there is at CSU, we have these climate summaries. So we have one for Eagle and Glenwood Springs here. And that will tell you your frost probability and length of growing season. So this is helpful also if you're wondering, you're just not quite sure if you have enough of a growing season to finish a vegetable. You can look here. And so let's see, let's look at the Glenwood one. We have different thresholds, 32, 28, and 24. And that's because some of those somewhat like spinach, it will survive a 32-degree frost easily. So that's why you have these different frost levels. But something like green beans get 32 degrees and they're done. They cannot tolerate frost at all. So that kind of helps you to know what you can get away with the different veggies. And then I usually just look at somewhere in between. So the 90% would be like, there's a 90% chance it will frost. So it's most likely still going to frost at this date. 50-50 chance of a frost. And then if you want to be really safe, then you can go down to the 10% chance. So I usually do this 28-degree threshold because at least for the cool season veggies, and then somewhere kind of in between the 50% and 10%. So like May 15th-ish, you can say. And then with the warm season veggies, your tomatoes, eggplants, things like that, then I'm usually a little more conservative. And in Eagle, I don't like to put tomatoes out or peppers or eggplant out until at least June 1st. So that's kind of what I go by. But you can get an idea on your spring frost date. And then it also has your fall frost. So if you're doing a second round, that can be helpful. And then, so what you do with that number or that date, so I'm going to go with, let's go with May. So we'll go in between, we'll go with May 20th. So not quite waiting until it's down to 10%, but pretty good. And then Johnny's Select Seeds has a seed starting calculator. That's incredibly helpful. So you just go here and then you put in your frost date, press enter, and it'll tell you the actual dates for every vegetable that you should be starting them. So this is kind of where I start when I'm planning out my calendar. I just put it in here, and then I write in my calendar when I want to be starting everything so that I remember. And then also it's really helpful though, because the following year you'll know, hey, well, I started that like a little bit too early last year, or a little too late. And then you can go back and look at your calendar and see the actual date that you started it, and have a better idea for the next year of when you want to get things started. Because all of this is still somewhat subjective to the microclimate that's actually in your yard. So you might have maybe a slightly warmer microclimate than average, or a slightly cooler. So it all kind of depends on your actual garden location too. But it gives you a really good idea of when to start, of where to start too. So like for cabbage, it has here to start your seeds between March 11th and April 22nd. And then the safe time, and then it also gives you the time that you can plant them outside. So you can add that in your calendar too, so you remember. Yeah, so for, what was I looking at? Cabbage. And then it has your set out date anywhere from the 22nd to the 20th of May. And the reason for that is because you can plant them out 4 weeks before your frost-free date, since they tolerate frost pretty well. I usually don't plant things out quite that early, but it's also usually because I get distracted and get other things going and just start a little late. But yeah, so this helps you plan out your seed starting date. And then the other thing that I do, I will start things sort of like a first round at the earlier end of these dates, and then wait at least a week and see what didn't sprout, and then kind of start another round. So I do a couple of rounds of starting. And so this helps me know when I need to be starting that process. Yeah, so this is an incredibly helpful tool. It also has the number of weeks to start seeds before setting them out. So this is kind of going to be your desired seedling age. So you want them to be, like I said, for cucumber, 3 to 4 weeks old max. So you'll see that on the squashes. They're all pretty young. So you don't want to start those guys out super early. But then something like celery, have to start it out 10 to 12 weeks at least. Yeah, so there's that tool. I'll go back to the presentation. So yeah, we went through looking at those. Planting depth is easy. Just go based on whatever the seed packet says. So in general, your smaller seeds are going to be planted more shallow, and your larger seeds are going to be planted deeper, but just go based on what it says on the seed packet. So here's 2 different examples of where it might say that on the seed packet. Here we've just got seed depth right at the top, 1/4 inch. And then this one over here is in culture. Sow seeds 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch deep. Yep, so planting depth, just go with the packet. Now, the next question is kind of how many seeds should I actually start? So you want to start 20% more seedlings than you want to plant out in your garden. And that gives you some chances for a few seedlings to fail. And then the amount of seeds I actually start like in each pot or in each cell sort of depends on how many seeds I have. You know, if it's a packet where I've only got a few seeds, I'll only put 1 in there, 1 or 2. But if I've got a ton of seeds of, for whatever reason, of some variety, then I might start a few more per container. but generally I just do 1 to 2. You will want to start more seeds, do more if they're old seeds, because your germination rate is going to go down as the seeds get older, or if the germination rate is listed below 95%. And then the other thing, start extras. If you're planting out earlier than the safe plant out date, so if you're starting it or you want to try and get a jump on, then you probably are going to want to start a couple backups in case of losses to frost. So here I just have an example. So I want 6 tomato plants out in my garden. And I would like to set 2 out. I want to try and start 2 a little earlier than normal. So I'm going to set 2 out in mid-May. So I might lose these 2. But I want at the end to have 6. So you do 6 times your 20%, so 1.2 plants. And so 6 plus 1.2 is 7.2. And that we're just going to round up to 8 because might as well. And then I'm going to start 2 extras for those to cover the 2 plants that I might lose from trying to start early in mid-May. So I am going to start 10 tomato seedlings in total. So that's kind of how you figure out how many you want to start, so that you're starting enough extra, but not like an excessive amount of extras. So. And then here's another picture of those seed packets, just because I wanted to point out where the germination rate is on those. So on some companies have it listed on the front there, germination 98%. So on these ones, you know that seed is going to germinate easily. Probably only need to put 1 seed per little container or division. And then on this one's only 75%. So on that one, you're going to want to start 2 or 3 probably per container. And it's not because this company's were like not as good as this company or something like that. It's just because of the plant and the actual seed it is. Some things just don't like to germinate as easily. They're just a little harder to get to germinate. So that's why there's the difference. All right. Now moving on to seedling care. Start with watering, the most important part of seedling care. So while you are sprouting, let me see here. If the seed is packed for 2022 and the seed life is 3 years, are they recommended using the seeds for 3 additional years? And yes, if they're packed the same year, then yeah, you can keep them, and they should still have about the same germination rate for 3 years. And after that, after the recommended seed life is up, so after those on that other packet from the picture before, I could just go back actually. Yeah, this one is a usual seed life 3 years. So the germination rate's going to stay decently stable for those 3 years, and then it'll drop off after that. That doesn't mean you can't plant them. You can still plant them. You'll just know that the germination rate's gonna probably drop quite a bit after that, but still go ahead and use them. All right, back to watering. So for watering, it needs to be consistently moist when you're sprouting the seeds. The soil cannot dry out during that time. So make sure that soil's staying moist until you see the seedling popping out of the soil there. So it needs to be consistently moist. I personally like to bottom water. So to do that, all you need to do is fill a tray or a pan. You could even use your sink or bathtub and then set your containers in that water to let it soak up. But you don't want to let them sit in water like that. So you just kind of do it until the soil has saturated completely, and then you want to take them back out of that water. So if they're constantly soggy, so if you leave them sitting in water constantly, then those roots are going to develop root rot, and that's no good for your seedlings. Another way to tell if you're excessively watering is if you're starting to get a lot of algae on the surface, the soil surface, then they're probably staying too wet. So algae on the soil surface, probably a little too much water. But yeah, I just like to bottom water, also because then sometimes with the overhead watering, it can increase fungal issues as well. So the bottom watering kind of helps with that. And this is a picture of before I watered. So the soil was pretty dry. You know, these seedlings they have some decent roots developed by now. They're not super tiny, so you can let the soil dry out a little bit more on the top. And then, so this was pre-watering, and then this is what it looks like after it had soaked up, completely saturated. And then took that tray and moved it from the standing water. Another thing is fertilizing. And if your starting mix has a lot of fertilizer already in it, you might not need to do this. But if you made your own and you didn't really add much fertilizer, then you're going to want to do this. And so you only start fertilizing though once the seedlings have at least one set of true leaves, or you can wait until they have 2 sets of true leaves. And so the true leaf, here's a little celery seedling that I have started. So these guys down here, these are not true leaves. These are called cotyledons. So these guys wouldn't count. So this up here, this is your first set of true leaves. So you want to wait until you're seeing these guys, not these little guys. And then this is going to be your second set of true leaves. So I haven't fertilized these guys yet. I'm going to wait until the second set is about the size of this guy, until they've popped out a little bit more. And so at the fertilizing, it's easiest to just, it's best to use a general purpose water soluble fertilizer, and then you just do it when you're watering. So you just add it in the bottom and with your water and let it soak up that way. And then another good thing to do for fertilizing seedlings is to do it at 1/4 to a half rate of the recommended strength. So whatever that strength is listed on the bottle, best to do it at 1/2 to 1/4, because too much fertilizer can easily damage the seedlings, and it's better to just give them a little boost than to give them too much. So, and then for timing, about every other week is good. So like about 10 to 14 days is going to be good for that. And then the last thing is temperature post sprouting. And I'm going through just kind of like the best practices. You know, of course, you don't need to necessarily do all of these to have success. This is just going to give you your best chances at success, and also best, most healthy seedlings. So temperature post, and this is post sprouting, so after they've already germinated. Because like I was talking about before, during germination, it's good to have that soil pretty warm. It helps a lot. But then after they sprout, they don't need it quite as warm. So especially the cool season vegetables, so your broccoli and cauliflower, once they've kind of gotten a little bit bigger, they've got some true leaves going on, getting some pretty good roots. Then you might want to consider, if you are using a heat mat, to remove them from the heat mat, because those cool season veggies, they like cooler nighttime temperatures. Around even 45 to 55 degrees is pretty ideal, and day temps 60 to 70-ish are good for these guys. They won't die or anything if they're too warm, but sometimes they'll grow too tall. They'll get kind of tall and leggy actually from the heat. So not bad to take them off the heat mat once they've gotten themselves a little bit established. The warm season veggies, on the other hand, night temps 60 to 65-ish are ideal. And then day temp 65 to 75. So if you are using a heat mat it's really helpful for the warm season veggies. You can set that on a timer once they've kind of gotten, they've grown a bit and have some true leaves. You can set that heat mat on a timer to turn off at night so that you get those little bit cooler temperatures, but it's not a huge deal or anything. So this is, if you want to really try and have the very best seedlings, then this is good to do, but it's not going to, it's not the biggest deal in the world if the temperature is a little off. But because of these cooler temperatures, that is why garages and crawl spaces and basements, places like that, are actually really good for starting seeds, because they are a little bit cooler, especially if you're doing your cool season veggies like your broccolis and cauliflower, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, spinach, those kinds of things. The tomatoes, eggplant, peppers, those guys all like it a little bit warmer. But yes, that's on temperature. And then so today we're not actually going to talk about hardening off. I'm saving that for next week. That's just, I think I had mentioned it in a previous slide very briefly. So I just want to let you know, we'll be talking about hardening off a little bit, focusing on it more next week. And that's just the process of acclimating your seedlings to go from your inside to your outside. And it's something that's extremely important to do here in Colorado. I have killed so many seedlings by setting them outside and thinking, oh, I'm going to bring them in an hour. But I set them right in the direct sun and they were already fried and dead within an hour. So hardening off is something that definitely needs to be done, and slowly. It takes a lot longer every year. I'm surprised how long it takes. But you need, at the very minimum, a week, usually at least 2 weeks for that hardening off process before you actually plant them in the ground. And it's not as much the temperature, it's really the sunlight, because the outdoor sunlight is just so much more intense than indoor light through a window or from our grow lights. It's just so much more intense that it tends to fry our little seedlings pretty fast here. So that's the main thing about hardening off, is adjusting the plants to that intense sunlight. But yeah, now I wanted to just take some time to answer any questions. I think, yep. Okay.
I got my question answered. Polly, do you have any questions? I think we're good, Denise.
Okay,
Thank you so much.
Very
And we'll
good.
look forward to part 3 next week.
sounds great.
We'll see you at 2 o'clock next Friday.
Thanks.
Okay, bye.
See ya. If I can figure out where the leave button is. Oh yeah, there it is.